Okay, so soil health, nutrient management. So soil health is it's a very broad topic, and it is somewhat vague as well. So I had to choose some aspect of it to hone in on this with regard to nutrients. And so what the aspect of it made the most sense, at least dominantly, what you're going to see is organic matter. When you get right down to it, the heart of soil health is organic matter. So you're going to see that theme throughout, not exclusively, but mostly. And so we're going to start with well, ultimately, we're going to talk about what does soil organic matter do, and what role does it play in nutrients and nutrient management and water quality as well. But we'll start broad with three main aspects of it: the physical impacts of soil organic matter, biological, and chemical, which we're going to spend the most on because we're talking about nutrients, and I'm a soil chemist, so we're talking about chemical. Although all three of these do interact. Okay, so we start with physical. First of all, what impact does soil organic matter, healthy soils have on the physical aspects of the soil? In a word, stability and tilth. So generally, as we increase organic matter, you increase aggregate stability, the size of the aggregates, aggregation, increased soil organic matter tends to decrease bulk density. Again, in a word, it improves soil tilth, improving the environment for rooting, for germination, etc. Second major area in which soil organic matter and improved soil health is going to impact physical properties of the soil is those that are related to water. Specifically, increased organic matter in soils is going to improve the water holding capacity of the soil and improve the ability of that soil to infiltrate water. So essentially, this improved physical properties is greater stability, greater infiltration, improved tilth, greater water holding capacity. That is going to translate to less runoff and less erosion, less loss of sediment. And this is a good thing. This is a good thing, especially for water quality. Decreasing erosion is always a good thing. Sediment itself is the #1 pollutant in the United States, probably the world. And in addition to the sediment itself being a problem, the nutrients bound on those sediments are a problem as well, especially phosphorus. Phosphorus bound to that being called particulate phosphorus. And so with water tending to move downward when you have improved soil health rather than off, that's always a good thing for nutrient transport. It's better to have water and nutrients move down rather than off. You want that water to leach downward instead of overland flow runoff, because, and I don't care if you have a tile drain or not, I still want that water to go downward, because at least the nutrients are there in the soil where they can possibly be taken up by the plant. And also the soil is a tremendous filter with regard to phosphorus. So if I have my choice of water flowing off or down, when it comes to water quality, I want it going down. And improved soil health is going to promote that. Okay, so there's water quality benefits to those improvements in physical properties, but also agronomic. And this is probably, in my opinion, probably the greatest benefit of improved soil health is the improvements in these physical properties, particularly related to water, because ultimately this can result in increased resilience of your crop yield because of these water, the changes in water holding capacity and everything related to water. And by resilience, what I mean is your healthier soils are not necessarily going to have the highest yields are not going to be super high, but on the flip side, the low yields are not going to be as low as the lower organic matter systems. In other words, the yield from these healthier soils, more organic rich soils, tends to be a bit more steady. In other words, resilient. And this this is a wonderful thing, and much of this is often attributed to the physical properties. In your extreme years of wetness and dryness, your healthier soils are going to be they're going to be able to withstand much better. And this isn't not a news flash to anyone, but we do tend to have more extreme in climate lately with regard to moisture. So the improvement in soil physical properties is going to help a lot. What about biology? So soil organic matter from improved soil health, that can have a big impact on biology. In a word, soil organic matter is the heart of that biology. If you build it, they will come. More organic matter is the habitat for organisms. That is the food for organisms. So generally, the more soil organic matter you have, the greater microbial activity you have. They can do more things. Now, that doesn't mean that the organisms can work miracles and that they can defy the laws of nature and the laws of thermodynamics. And so one thing I want to point out that's going to be a reoccurring theme, we all have to keep in mind when we're talking about what soil health can and cannot do. You keep in mind the law of conservation of matter, which comes from the second law of thermodynamics. Very simple. Matter, for example, elements, nutrients, they cannot be created or destroyed. They can only change forms, they can change phases, they can change their location, but they cannot be created or destroyed. It's a fixed amount. And keep that in mind. Okay, so increased microbial activity in biology with more organic matter, that's great, but they're doing more stuff. But what can they do? In a word, they increase nutrient cycling, and this is particularly important for nitrogen, specifically mineralization of organic nitrogen and immobilization, going the opposite direction of immobilizing inorganic nitrogen into organic. And it can go both ways on depending on carbon to nitrogen ratios. Sometimes I know producers who they have to because they've built up so much carbon over the years, they have to add extra nitrogen up front in order to overcome that nitrogen being fixed ultimately by the carbon. But on the other hand, with a healthier soil, more organic matter, if it's more efficient in preventing nitrogen losses, you have more nitrogen from one year to the next, more nitrogen recovered. You may have to, oftentimes you'll have producers who have to add less nitrogen as they take into account that background soil nitrogen pool. And this is a very nice pool because it's an organic nitrogen pool, so it tends to be a slow release. So it's a double-edged sword. It can hurt you when you need it. If it's tied up when you need it, it's a problem. But if it's tied up, you're not losing it either. So the slow release organic nitrogen is very beneficial in wet years when your inorganic nitrogen is being flushed down the drain. I've seen this a benefit with it's similar in comparing manure sources of nitrogen to inorganic fertilizer. In your wet years, your manure sources are going to outperform your inorganic nitrogen sources because they slowly release it, whereas the inorganic gets flushed out quick if it's a really wet year. So in a word, increased biology is very important to nutrient cycling, specifically for nitrogen, not very important for phosphorus. Phosphorus activity is dominated by abiotic processes, not biological processes, except in low phosphorus systems that have little to no removal of phosphorus. So we're talking in that case about forests and rangelands, sometimes low phosphorus pastures. In those cases, phosphorus biological activity is very important. It's much more important for nitrogen. Okay. So organic matter impact on chemical properties. So look at the chemical properties of soil organic matter. It contains different types of functional groups. One of the big groups, they are variable charge functional groups, and with it, they are able to buffer the soil pH. These variable charge functional groups provide cation exchange capacity for storing cations. They do have a very limited anion exchange capacity. They can hold cations much better than anions. They can increase the availability of tightly bound trace metals through these certain types of functional groups. And the nonpolar functional groups on soil organic matter are really good at retaining pesticides and organic contaminants. So you'll see sometimes in certain herbicide labels, you have to adjust your rate as a function of the amount of organic matter in your soil. That's why. So specifically, there's three main types of functional groups on organic matter. There's acidic, neutral, and basic groups. And depending on which one, they can do different things. The acidic groups tend to be your main source of CEC. The basic functional groups provide some anion exchange capacity, and your neutral groups are the ones that are nonpolar that tend to absorb herbicides and various pesticides. So soil organic matter has a lot of functional groups and a quantity and different types as well. This is just a sketch of a kind of a generic humic substance, just to show you the so you can see that you know, they do have many different types of functional groups on there, and they're doing things. Those acidic functional groups are particularly important because they provide a variable negative charge. Specifically, as the pH goes up, they become more negatively charged. They can hold more cations. And so if your soil is particularly sandy and you know, depending on the mineralogy, if it doesn't have much of a CEC from the minerals, the addition of soil organic matter can account for a very, very high percentage. It can add a lot of CEC to your soil. Now again, this is a variable charge. So the charge, your CEC increases as the pH goes up. And the reason this is due to the dissociation of acid, of protons from those functional groups. For example, below you see a carboxyl group on the edge of organic matter. It's protonated at a low pH. As you increase the pH, you see that this proton is gone. It's deprotonated to the solution, and it left behind a negative charge, which allows a cation to be stored on it, to be bound on it. So this is a reversible reaction. So at low pH, the protons go back on, and it has a neutral charge. At high pH, it jumps off, and it produces the CEC then. And naturally, with the proton going on and off, you can imagine that also buffers the pH of the system. So high organic matter soils act to buffer your pH, kind of keep it more steady at around pH 6, a little above 6. That's a good thing. Okay, before we go further, we talk a little bit about the nature of soil and plant nutrient dynamics. It's very important to keep in mind that plants do not take up nutrients directly from the soil. Okay? Plants take up nutrients from the solution. The soil is a warehouse of nutrients, and there's different pools in the soil that retain nutrients. There's more strongly held nutrients on the soil. We call those non-labile, and there's more easily available nutrients. We call them labile, and those pools are in equilibrium with each other. And then it's that labile, that loosely bound pool. It releases nutrients into solutions, dissolved. And then once it's in solution, then the plant can take it up. So the nutrient has to be in solution in order for a plant to take it up, and it has to be inorganic. Plants they don't take up organic forms of nutrients. It has to be mineralized first to an inorganic form. So with that in mind, soil organic matter can improve the solubility of micronutrients through natural chelating agents. And obviously, this is real important to plant nutrition. Especially for something like copper and zinc. You know, normally copper and zinc are very insoluble in soil. It doesn't go into solution very easily, so it's not plant available. But organic matter-rich soils provide humic substances, particularly fulvic acid, and they're natural chelating agents, and they can increase the solubility of it. So, for example, you've got your soil-bound copper here. It's bound to the soil. It doesn't go off very easily, so it's not very plant available. And then you've got your dissolved fulvic acid that comes from organic rich soils floating around in solution. This is a dissolved organic compound. And what it does is this fulvic acid can complex. It kind of rips the copper off of the soil mineral and puts it in this chelate. So now this thing is still in solution. It's dissolved. This is not solid organic matter. And then depending on the plant, and the type of machinery that the roots have, the chelate can then re-release that copper plant root so that it can take it up again in an inorganic form. So it can behave as a natural chelating agent. Okay, we'll move on and talk the rest of the time about nitrogen and phosphorus. But before we do that, I need to speak a little bit on the essence of nitrogen and phosphorus, how they're different. They are very different. Their nature impacts their behavior. Now, at first blush, they look similar. You look at their electron configuration, you say, well, they both have 5 outer shell electrons, pretty similar. They both exist as oxyanions, nitrate, NO3, phosphate, PO4, but their electronegativity is different. And as a result, they behave radically different. And I could summarize it just by saying this. Phosphorus is very sticky. Nitrogen is not. Phosphorus sticks to the soil very, very strongly. Nitrogen does not. So how that manifests itself, nitrogen not being held very well, if the nitrogen is not taken up by the plant, then there is high potential for it to be lost through leaching, through subsurface drainage, or as a gas. In a sentence, if nitrogen, if it's not taken up, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. Okay, that's the opposite of phosphorus. Phosphorus is very immobile compared to nitrogen. So most of your applied nitrogen is or will become available over the growing season, but most applied phosphorus is not going to become available over the growing season. Most of it is going to be held by the soil because it sorbs so strongly. And that is why we have such a thing can exist as legacy soil phosphorus. Because of this nature of phosphorus, it can accumulate in the soil. There are soils, I can show you soils that have so much phosphorus accumulate in it, you literally would not have to apply phosphorus to them for 50 years, no exaggeration. But there's no such thing as a legacy soil nitrogen. It does not accumulate very much in the soil. Even if you over apply nitrogen, you're usually going to need to apply the following year because you're going to lose it. So for the same reason why we don't have legacy soil nitrogen, at least not on the same time scale, is the same reason why you can have legacy groundwater nitrogen, if you know what I mean. Okay, talk a little bit about cover crops. Cover crops here I'm defining simply as live cover that's established between growing seasons that is not harvested. I'm assuming in all this that the cover crop is not harvested. So cover crops, what do? They provide some organic matter. They do not add nutrients unless it's a legume. If it's a legume, then you're adding nitrogen. But other than that, you're not adding nutrients. Now, it can relocate nutrients. It can relocate nitrogen and possibly potassium if you have potassium in your subsoil, but that's going to depend. If you've got an altisol, probably not. If you got an alphasol, there's some potential to move some of the surface. So cover crops are very good at scavenging subsurface nitrogen that was not taken up by the plant during the growing season, and that reduces nitrate losses in tile drainage and runoff, as you can see it from this study in 2022 journal Environmental Quality. There's several studies like that. Now, on the other hand, for phosphorus, there's very little phosphorus in the subsurface to move to the surface. Because phosphorus tends to be, again, dominated. It doesn't move very much out of the surface. Now, the cover crop may slightly shift the phosphorus pool. It may shift it into different pools, making it more available, or it can make it less available. It all depends. So cover crops, with regard to water quality, they are highly effective at reducing total phosphorus, specifically particulate phosphorus, that is phosphorus bound on sediment, just due to the fact that they reduce erosion. And anytime you stop erosion, you reduce particulate phosphorus. But there's not much reduction, if any, in dissolved phosphorus losses. And this fits with the essence of phosphorus. The soils are highly buffered in phosphorus. They can keep resupplying the solution again and again. Not true for nitrogen. So unlike nitrogen, very little of the percentage of phosphorus that's in solution exists in solution. So phosphorus is well buffered, nitrogen is not. So for example, plants can take up the majority of nitrogen with water uptake. That's not true for phosphorus. So corn, for example, just through water uptake alone, corn can take up 79% of its nitrogen. But for phosphorus, through water uptake alone, it's only going to get half a percentage of the phosphorus it needs. So what this ultimately means is that the majority of soil nitrogen can be taken up before a major drainage event, but that's not true for phosphorus. It's not possible for a cover crop to do this unless by some miracle you had a cover crop that could take up, I don't know, 10 years worth of a conventional crop soil phosphorus in 3 months growing in the winter. Okay, because that soil is buffered, it'll just keep resupplying it. So we don't, cover crops shouldn't be able to do much for dissolved phosphorus. In fact, what we see is that sometimes they can actually increase dissolved phosphorus losses through the crop residue leaching. And indeed, that's what we see in studies that show nice reduction in particulate phosphorus, total phosphorus usually, but no change or an increase in dissolved phosphorus losses. Again, that's just the difference between the nature of phosphorus versus the nature of nitrogen. One is buffered by the other one is not. Okay, well, there's a lot of extraordinary claims about cover crop benefits and all these special magical rhizosphere of microorganisms. Keep in mind that anything that a winter cover crop can do, a crop growing during the regular growing season can do better. Because biological activity for plants, for microorganisms is much, much less in the winter. If you want to talk about nutrient uptake, you get a lot more of it going on with your conventional crop in the summertime. So keep that in mind. Okay, cover crops and phosphorus availability. The short answer to this one is that cover crops have a variable impact on phosphorus availability. It can go either way. It can make it more available or it can make it less available as it shifts phosphorus from one pool into another. Here we see Bray phosphorus as impacted by 11 years of a cover crop, 4 different types of cover crops, and 3 out of 4 cases here, the cover crop reduced the phosphorus availability as indicated by Bray phosphorus. But on the other hand, you can see it go the other way as well. This is after 5 years of a rye cover crop. You see that in northern Ohio, southern Ohio, and Indiana. In one case, the cover crop improved the malic 3 phosphorus concentration. In the other cases, no differences. So it can go either way. All right, now for the remainder here, let's talk about this is a collection of some different, and this isn't all of them, different statements that I've heard over the years with regard to soil health, some claims. We'll call it truth or myth. Some of these are myths, some of them are myths, but have a grain of truth in them somewhere. We're going to try to sort through them. Okay, here's one. Maybe some of you have heard this. I don't need to apply phosphorus anymore because I have good soil health. Now that doesn't surprise me because, again, recall the nature of soil phosphorus. It does accumulate, right? And if it's built up, then yeah, you sure can. You can get away with that for a few years. It's highly buffered by the soil. But whenever you apply less phosphorus than what's taken off, by default, you're mining the soil. And eventually, if you continue that soil-bound phosphorus, what we call the quantity, is going to be mined to the point where it can no longer supply a sufficient concentration of the solution peat. That's what the plant actually sees, what it can uptake solution. It won't be able to supply enough to meet the mass demand because crops require a certain mass of phosphorus to be taken up. That's also part of the law of conservation of matter. So again, phosphorus, there's no gaseous phase of phosphorus. It cannot be fixed from the atmosphere like nitrogen can, okay? So soil health can potentially improve phosphorus accessibility and phosphorus application efficiency. And what I mean by that is it can increase the percentage of phosphorus that's applied that remains soluble and available to the plant. But it does not defeat the mass requirement of the plant. I'll give you an example. Corn has to uptake 580 milligrams of phosphorus per plant in order for it to produce maximum yield. I don't care where that phosphorus comes from. I don't care if it's an inorganic source. I don't care if it's an organic source that becomes mineralized. I don't care if it's phosphorus that was applied 50 years ago or if it's phosphorus applied that season. It needs 580 milligrams taken up. All right. And so most of that phosphorus that's taken up by the corn plant, for example, is going to be allocated to the grain. So when you harvest the grain, most of that's going to be removed. So you're mining it from the soil. So phosphorus, it has to be replaced. That phosphorus, that 580 milligrams taken up, or less with the residue returned and the grain removed, it's got to be replaced when you harvest it. Now, some will say, well, with my healthier soil, I get deeper roots, and so I don't have to apply phosphorus anymore. Well, deeper roots can help, not necessarily phosphorus very much, but even then, again, you still can't defeat the loss of thermodynamics here. You have to, if you're mining it, you have to replace it. That set aside, deeper roots is not necessarily going to help you very much with phosphorus. It'll help you a lot with nitrogen and with water and things like that. But remember, most of your phosphorus is within the upper portion of the soil in the top 6 inches. Subsoil phosphorus tends to be very low, so there's not much to be scavenged down there in most soils. It's important to keep in mind that improved soil health does not make more phosphorus. It can only shift pools. So we hear a lot about organisms, these living rhizosphere microorganisms, and with regard to phosphorus, they are mostly negligible. And the reason why is because the amount of phosphorus that's held in microbial biomass in the rhizosphere is very small. It's less than 3% of the daily requirement of corn uptake, for example. Also, you can consider there were a lot of studies conducted on sterilized soils versus non-sterilized soils, and generally, there's no difference. In fact, it's been suggested, and some research has shown that rhizosphere microorganisms can actually compete with plant roots and potentially reduce plant availability. Now, that's free living microorganisms. Now, there are symbiotic microorganisms. Specifically, there's one very, very important one that does tend to proliferate in healthy soils rich in organic matter, and that is mycorrhizae. So this is an associative rhizosphere microorganism, not a free living one. And essentially what mycorrhizae do is that they effectively increase the root surface area. And this is really important for trace nutrient, copper, zinc. For your immobile nutrients, it's really important for phosphorus because your uptake of those nutrients is dependent upon root surface area. All right. So they tend to increase phosphorus uptake very well in low phosphorus soils. Once your soil P levels start to increase to the point where your concentrations in solution get to be anywhere from 0.1 to 1.6 milligrams per liter, you tend to not see a benefit in yield anymore. But in low P soils, mycorrhizae will make or break you. All right. Now, again, it's important to keep in mind, there's nothing magical about them. The mycorrhizae, they are accessing the same soluble phosphorus pools as what plant roots do. They just effectively increase the surface area of the roots because they're connected to them. And mycorrhizae is very important for certain plants, specifically something like cassava. And I think most of you know that tillage tends to reduce the infection. So your healthier soils, organic matter that haven't seen a plow in a long time, they tend to have a higher occurrence infection rate of mycorrhizae. So increasing the organic matter in the soil, again, it doesn't make more phosphorus, but it can change its solubility. Now, it can change it for the better. but it can also change it for the worse. I can point you to studies that show either one, and it depends on the soil properties. Ultimately, a lot of it depends on mineralogy. You can decrease solubility by developing more poorly soluble organic P forms that are more amorphous forms of aluminum iron. But at the same token, you can also produce a lot of dissolved organic compounds, organic carbon compounds that can block phosphorus sorption sites and increase the phosphorus solubility. It can go either way. It's very difficult to predict. So this can impact phosphorus efficiency, but it's not going to change the mass of phosphorus required for plant uptake. Again, for example, your corn plant needs 580 milligrams to be taken up. You aren't changing that with improved soil health. Now, you can be more efficient. A healthier soil, it can achieve, perhaps it might be able to achieve a maximum yield at a lower background malic 3P level. For example, maybe instead of reaching max yield at a malic 3P level of 30, you can achieve it at 10 or 15. But you still have to replace that phosphorus that you took away. You maintain a lower background. That doesn't change the mass requirement. Something that will have probably a bigger impact on phosphorus solubility rather than organic matter is pH. pH has a dramatic impact on phosphorus solubility and therefore plant availability. You tend to get your sweet spot between pH of 6 and 7. You get your maximum solubility. And then in your acidic soils, it tends to get tied up, low solubility, therefore low plant availability. Okay, here's another one I heard. I don't need a nutrient management plan anymore because of cover crops or because of improved soil health. So absolutely not. Nutrient management plans is about mass balance. It's about accounting of nutrients and applying them at the right time, at the right place, and in the right form, and then have it in structural practices that keep them from leaving the field. So remember, you can't defeat that mass balance, the law of the conservation of mass. Here's another one. Cover crops and no-till have less phosphorus stratification than tilled soils. Absolutely not. I don't know where this idea came from, but it defies the nature of phosphorus because it's mostly immobile. I wouldn't even have to do an experiment to tell you this, but the fact is there's hundreds of experiments and publications that do empirical evidence. We have empirical and rational and simply rational logic shows that this is not true. No-till soils are more stratified in phosphorus than a tilled soil. Agronomic soil tests don't measure organic phosphorus. This is not true. Malic 3 and Bray extracts contain acid and fluoride, both of which can extract some of the tightly bound phytate phosphorus, and phytate P dominates as far as your organic phosphorus forms in the soil. It depends on the minerals. Some minerals do hold on to it a bit tighter than others, as you can see here. Other soil extracts, even the Olsons based on bicarbonate, that can extract some organic phosphorus. It tends to maintain a high pH, and that hydrolyzes some of the soil organic matter, releasing some organic phosphorus. This one's similar, goes along with the last one. The scientists who developed soil phosphorus tests did not understand organic P. This is absolutely not true. And if you question that, I highly recommend getting the old ASA publication, American Society of Agronomy publication from 1980, the big book simply called Phosphorus. And that compiles much of what was done between 1950 and 1980. And you'll find out very quickly that they understood organic phosphorus very well. In fact, Adolf Malick, the scientist who developed the Malick 3, Malick 1, 2, and 3 extracts, he specifically used organic phosphorus compounds in addition to other compounds as he developed those extracts. Organic phosphorus is a large untapped soil phosphorus pool for crops. Okay, when we think about that, back up and consider a few things here. The amount of organic phosphorus in the soil is proportional to soil organic matter. The more soil organic matter you build up, the more organic phosphorus you're going to have. So how much soil organic matter do we have in soils? It ranges from about 0.5% to 5% of organic matter in your surface horizon, much less below that. And among that soil organic matter, 0.5% of it is organic P. All right, so consider that. Next, consider that organic matter has to be mineralized in order for that phosphorus to become plant available. And you certainly don't want to mineralize all of it. You can't have your organic matter and eat it too. Let's just put it that way. So the organic phosphorus pool is very critical in low phosphorus systems that have little to no harvest. So forests and rangeland, again, some low P pastures, it's very important. It's less important in conventional crops, but regardless, keep in mind that law of the conservation of mass. If you are burning through it, if you're burning through your organic phosphorus and taking it up, mineralize it, taking it by the plant, you're going to have to replace it. Last one. Soluble phosphorus additions inhibit phosphorus uptake. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that means. This might be a statement about root growth. It's not exactly true. In reality, it's more about root distribution and phosphorus distribution. So I can't get into the details of it right now, but I'll just say this. Phosphorus distribution does impact root distribution, and both phosphorus distribution and root distribution impact phosphorus uptake. So ultimately, there is a happy medium between root proliferation, root density, and phosphorus distribution. All right, and I think that's the end of those. So thank you, and I'm ready for any questions here.
All right. If you have questions, certainly put them in the chat box. I had one come in that I saw for sure, and it was early in the presentation from Joe regarding the nitrogen that gets stored in soil organic matter. Does it show up in soil tests that would influence a farmer's decisions about nitrogen application? In other words, does it typically get accounted for when they're calculating application rates for fertilizers?
Yeah, if depending on the type of soil testing program they're using. I mean, some people don't. I mean, often a lot of producers they don't even bother with soil nitrogen testing. But yeah, a lot of your good agronomists are going to take into account the amount of organic matter in the soil, and then they're going to assume a certain nitrogen content within that organic matter, and then a certain percentage of that organic matter that's going to mineralize during that growing season, and they will bank on that, which is wise. It's similar with manure. When we use manure as a nitrogen source, we've got a portion of that manure has inorganic nitrogen, a portion has organic nitrogen, and the inorganic nitrogen is 100% available that growing season. The organic nitrogen, your good agronomists are going to apply a certain mineralization factor to that and say X percentage of the organic nitrogen, knowing how much organic nitrogen is in it, is going to become available this growing season, and X percentage of it is going to become available the next growing season. So yes, it can be taken into account.
Yeah, I would just agree with you. And here in Nebraska, and one of the things that you didn't really mention there was that weather can have a huge effect on how much of that mineralizes. And so
Absolutely.
Different availabilities are going to be different across the US, actually across the world because of that. Without moisture, it can't mineralize. So
Yes.
it's really a best guess. So every state's going to have a little different recommendation on that. But
in my dry years, I see the inorganic sources of nitrogen outcompete the organic sources. In the wet years, it's the opposite.
Yep. All right, other questions before we go to a breakout room? Thank you so much, Chad. Oh, here from David. Is there a conflict between high soil organic matter and the ability to amend pH? So he says here in the UK, some permanent grassland fields have soil organic matters above 10%. So I assume that you mentioned the buffer pH.
Right.
And how much that changes at that high of a soil organic matter. Does it affect it more?
Well, I mean, theoretically, I can tell you the direction, I can't necessarily tell you the magnitude, but in direction, increasing your organic matter is going to increase the pH buffer capacity of that soil. And theoretically, it is going to require, I'll put it this way, you're going to maintain that pH, your ideal pH longer. But once it comes time to have to amend it and increase it after it drops, it is going to take more lime to do that. Now, exactly how much, I can't say offhand. It's going to vary from soil to soil, and the type of as far as the type of functional groups in the organic matter is going to make a difference as well. But like I said, the direction is yes, it is going to take more. I can't tell you how much, but here's the thing: your buffer, when you do a good with a good soil testing program, you're not just going to measure pH, you're going to measure buffer pH, whatever it is in your area, SMP, Adams, Evans, whatever, and that is going to indirectly take into account the buffer capacity of your soil. So not to worry, if it does increase that buffer capacity, so you need to add more, it will take it into account.
So utilize your soil test is what I just heard from that.
Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always love hearing that. Tess, just as she says, not a comment and not a question, but I really enjoyed the truth and myth part of the presentation and the discussion around the kernel, where the kernel of truth might have started. And I'm with her on that 100%. That was by far my favorite part of the presentation. You could have done that the entire time and I would have been happy. Not that the rest of it wasn't good, but I was really excited about that too.
Thank you. I guess I had some other ones that I cut. Maybe I shouldn't have cut them.
All right. Gord asks,
in
a high P soil test situation, to what level should we mine it before we start adding back seed placed phosphorus? So when can we start seeing a response to phosphorus indicates wheat or corn?
Oh, that's a traditional fertility question. And so the traditional answer is, you've got buildup and maintenance. And so for example, in the tri-state area here, that is Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, we like to keep it between 20 and 30 milligrams per kilogram. And you may, when it's in that range, you're going to reach optimum yield. And when you're in that range, you can add crop removal rates of phosphorus. That is, anticipating how much phosphorus will be removed from that crop that growing season. That's how much you add. So theoretically, you will maintain that same phosphorus level between 20 and 30 from there on out. Now, the idea then is if it does end up dropping below 20, you want to amend it to bring it back up to between 20 and 30 milligrams per kilogram again. And then, again, you want to maintain it there. If you drop below it, you ended up inadvertently mining it, build and maintain. If you're above it, if you're above 30, there's a lot of soils that are, 30, 40, 50, then, you don't need to apply any at all and just keep mining it until you get down into that range of between 20 and 30, at least for corn and beans in our area. And so look at what your state recommends for your ideal range.
Right. So your land grant institutions are going to have those recommendations. I know Iowa and Nebraska are similar in that range as well. So I don't know where you're coming to us from, Gord, but check out your land grant institution. Their fertility recommendations will have those rough thresholds to go by. Daniel asks, all the biological bacteria that we can add in starter, either on seed or over the soil, will that solubilize and release phosphorus and micronutrients? And is that another one of your myths? I think that's what he's getting at. Is that another one of the myths out there?
There's so many of these. My agronomist friends refer to them as bugs in a jug. And I can tell you from the perspective of soil chemist working soil fertility, I do not see much potential in that at all. I personally do not do, again, I understand how these systems work, and based on logic and understanding the nature of these systems, I don't think that it would work. Do I specifically test them myself? No, I don't. But I'll give you one example. So here at Purdue, our corn agronomist Dan Quinn, he just released the 2023 agronomy trials, and at many of the research stations here, they tested all kinds of these products, and you can see the report for yourself. It's it's online, it's free, Purdue, but none of them, I don't think not a single one of them impacted the yield. None.
All
Now,
right.
I'm not talking about nitrification inhibitors there. I'm excluding nitrification inhibitors.
So, Chad, what were some of the other truths? That's exactly what I was thinking, Tess. Great minds think alike.
Can you still see my screen?
We can. We see your presentation.
Okay, well, I'll skip this one. This is corn yield after rye. Here we go. Here's a good one. Chemical fertilizer ages the soil hundreds of years. Now, this probably comes more from the organic farmers rather than the soil health gurus, but I have heard it, and I'm not even sure what it means. I think, again, trying to make sense out of it, I think it could be a reference to soil acidification, because the soil, it naturally acidifies on its own, but it takes long, decades, hundreds of years for it to acidify naturally. But, through the addition of ammonium-based nitrogen sources, particularly when we apply them in excess, as that ammonium nitrifies, it's going to produce 2 moles of acidity per mole of ammonium. So this can really speed up the acidification of soils. I saw that a lot in Oklahoma and no-till. The top, these were really alkaline soils, but in the top 2 inches in no-till, they would have a pH of 5, and then you go right below that, you'd be right back to a pH of 8. And so they can rapidly increase acidification. That might be what that's meant when they say chemical fertilizer ages the soil hundreds of years. Maybe, maybe not, but that's my stab at it. Let's see, this one just fascinates me, but I hear this a lot. Plants and microorganisms communicate with each other in their community. I don't even have bullets on this one because I decided to cut it, but I think the word communicate is used very loosely. There is stimulus and response, but it is not communication as we are communicating right now. It's not as if they're friends and they're trading. It's stimulus and response, and it is every man for themselves, ultimately in that plant microorganism world. So yeah, that's not communication.
Right. I think we tend to maybe oversimplify when we say things like that because we put brains in those plants that they maybe don't have the way that we do. So agreed. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll pull it to a close. Go ahead, Joe. You should have.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm the State Nutrient Reduction Strategy Coordinator for the state of Wisconsin, and I'm getting lots of pressure and requests from folks to focus on soil health as a strategy for addressing water quality issues. And because of the many presentations I've seen and the sort of variety of results, depending on which aspect of soil health you're talking about and which aspect of water quality, or, is it nitrates or phosphorus? Would you say that it would be better to focus on the different aspects of soil health and so segregate out the different practices and talk about what are the impacts on water quality of the different practices associated with soil health, like organic matter and things like that, rather than just a blanket statement saying
Yes.
soil health is good for water quality.
Yes, I agree with you. Stick to nutrient management, okay? And within nutrient management, you have various practices as a tool to use. So for example, a cover crop can be used as a tool within nutrient management. Cover crops are not nutrient management, but they are a tool that can reduce erosion and reduce particulate losses of phosphorus. So I think soil health can be, and again, I agree with you 100%. It cannot be treated so vaguely, so blank, as a blanket, like, okay, you have soil health, so I'll just use that in my nutrient management plan. We have to be specific about these things and what aspects we're talking about. Specifically, those specific aspects, I'm using the word specific a lot, using those specific aspects of soil health within the nutrient management plan. Where does it fit within the nutrient management plan? It's just more tools in the shed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very helpful.
Good question. I hear that a lot. I see that a lot. I see, I'll see groups, putting out, maybe called propaganda, borderline, that the answer to all of our nutrient woes is just, they'll put at the top of the list, improve soil health. Well, what's that mean? Or just use cover crops. It's like, we got to be deductive about these sorts of things.
So I would add to that, Joe, we, as the Soil Health Nexus, and I'm not an author, but I did review it. We put out a white paper here, year and a half, 2 years ago now, actually, already, on soil health and water quality, and kind of talks about the pros and cons, actually, because there is some detrimental water quality things to soil health, to improving that infiltration. If you're concerned about nitrate, for sure, if you increase that infiltration, you actually might have more concerns. So I encourage you to check that out. I did put the link in the chat box for you to look at, and otherwise it's on our website as well in the toolbox.
Yeah, I actually have that and reference it and quote it often.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it's being used.
It's nice to know somebody's reading your work and using it, isn't it?
It is great. So just reading, Jenny commented in response to Daniel's question, what if the question for the producers isn't about the yield? What if the question is, do these types of products, and this is going back to those biological products, make the nutrients more available so the growers can cut back on nutrients? Did they see anything that way in those studies?
Oh, can it improve efficiency?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that.
Jenny's full of good questions.
That's a good question.
Sounds like an on-farm research trial, Jenny. Jenny is from Nebraska here too. I worked with her. So Nathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it goes back to Chad's thing of conservation and principles. I mean, at some point it might be more efficient, let's say, in the short term, but at some point you're still removing those nutrients. So at some point you're going to be mining the soil, even if it's more efficient in the short term. You can save phosphorus applications in the short term, but in 10 years or 20 years, at some point you can't not apply and just rely on microorganisms only. It just depends of how long.
That's correct. Efficiency is just that. It doesn't change the mass balance of the situation. It might allow you to maintain a lower level, but it doesn't mean that you can replace it with less. Yes, that's a good way to think of it.